Hello and welcome to Matouk Mystery, the podcast. Tonight, the motives for murder and the latest news on the investigation into the death of JoAnn Matouk Romain. The national TV show Unsolved Mysteries left millions of people believing JoAnn was murdered and did not commit suicide, as local police have suggested for the past 10 years. The public is outraged that the FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office, Michigan State Police, the State Attorney General's Office, the Wayne County Prosecutor, pretty much any law enforcement seems to be doing little or nothing about the evidence that suggests this 55-year-old mother of three was kidnapped and killed after leaving church in Grosse Pointe Farms on January 12, 2010. Tonight, we're going to get into the possible motives for murder and look at the suspects profiled in the Unsolved Mystery show and in other media reports. Joining us now is Scott Burnstein, who is doing the most in-depth media investigation into this case in the Grosse Pointe News. Scott, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kevin.
So let's start with the suspects.
Let's also let me make a quick comment before we start.
Sure.
It is playing on what you just said. For someone that's only really known about this case for 4 months, 3-4 months, I haven't been following it for 10 years. It is incredibly disturbing that all of the checks and balances here, the law enforcement that should be all in on this, have basically been sitting on their hands for a decade. And it's taken Unsolved Mysteries to come on the scene and my reporting and Channel 4's reporting to just get even a glimpse or a glimmer of action from these guys, or hoping that there will be action from Wayne County Prosecutor, FBI, State's Attorney, so forth and so forth. I can't imagine having to have gone through this as a member of the victim's family for a decade and just screaming from the rooftops for help and just being constantly ignored. That, to me, is one of the most disturbing aspects of this. Not just that you have this incredibly complex, layered mystery where, to me, it's pretty obvious this woman didn't commit suicide. Now, who killed her and why they killed her are the questions. But for federal law enforcement and the Michigan Attorney General and the Wayne County Prosecutor not to even show a modicum of interest in diving into this any deeper than just saying, oh, well, Grosse Pointe Woods and Grosse Pointe Farms declared it a suicide. What do we elect these people for?
Yeah, so it's frustrating that the media is leading the way to look into this mystery. Clearly, many people do not think this was a suicide.
I mean, it's clear as day.
So
you can argue about who did it and why it was done, but to sit here 10 years later and look at all the evidence in front of you and being objective and saying that this woman committed suicide is just counter to every fact and every notion or instinct anyone would have in front of them or, part of them.
Let's bring Bill Tullock in and see. Bill Tullock, retired police officer. Bill, can you hear us?
I can hear you, Kevin. Is this any better?
Yeah, it's great. Tell us your thoughts on where is law enforcement? Why is the media doing this investigation?
I really don't have a clue other than, no one wants to have a homicide in a bedroom community. It's probably easier to write it off as a suicide than it would be to call it a homicide. But, after 10 years and the fact that she was missing for a period of time from her disappearance till the time the body was recovered, again, I think it probably would be smart to reopen the investigation and see where it may lead.
And what's incredibly incongruent, and I know I touched on this last week, but I want to reemphasize it right now, is that the behavior and posturing and approach of local law enforcement, Grosse Pointe Woods and Grosse Pointe Farms, on the night she disappeared, for that first, let's say, 12 hours, it was this all hands on deck mentality where you put together this whole kind of dog and pony show, a 3-ring circus of planes and helicopters and dogs and boats and looking like you were looking for the Queen of England, and then less than 24 hours later you just wipe your hands of it. So if it was so important to put out the law enforcement quote unquote full court press on January 12th, 2010, why did they just throw it away and put it into a cupboard or a file and close that file, pretty much a day later? I mean, if it was so important on January 12th, why wasn't it important on January 13th?
Well, I agree with you. I think should have been all hands on deck, at least until the time the body was found.
Yeah, especially when you don't have a body. I mean, it makes no sense.
But Scott,
It should have been a kidnapping at that point.
Yes, I
Don't you
believe it
think?
should have been looked at as a kidnapping
And
right
the
off the bat, which would have brought the FBI in right away.
Right. Does that make sense to you, Bill?
It does. It does. You know, we're still looking for Carol Kresge DeArmond, and she's been gone for 30 plus years.
So I want to talk a little bit about the suspects and the motives, because really we've established, or all the investigating has pretty much established, that this was a kidnapping and a murder, most likely.
And I think there are pretty much 3 suspects that the press or whoever has investigated it at the minimal level that they've investigated it have zeroed in on 3 separate people as suspects.
So I want to start. JoAnn's kids have said that JoAnn was afraid of her cousin Tim Matouk. In fact, several people told police that JoAnn told them in the weeks before her death, if something happens to me, look at Tim Matouk. So let's start with that. Scott, who is Tim Matouk, and why would he be a suspect?
Tim Matouk is a decorated police officer that's been in law enforcement in Metro Detroit since the 1980s. He started at the Detroit Police Department during the crack epidemic, worked homicide in DPD from, I believe, 1985 to 1990. He then moved on to the Harper Woods Police Department, where he was a detective, which is where he was working and who he was working for when JoAnn disappeared. But by the time they found JoAnn's body, he had actually changed jobs and been hired by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office and Kim Worthy to be one of their, if not their lead investigators, lead detectives. He's had a pretty impressive career if you're just looking at it, the records in terms of the type of cases he's made. He was from talking to people in law enforcement, he was the linchpin in breaking the Bob Bashara case out of Grosse Pointe. If people remember, Bob Bashara was a man who had hired someone to kill his wife, and there was a lot of kind of salacious circumstances around it with Bashara being into S&M and whatnot. But Tim made that case. And, Tim, I think when you talk to law enforcement people that are familiar with Tim over the last 30 years, you get kind of a mixed bag. Some people say he's a great police officer and he's kind of above reproach. You have other people that have said that maybe he pushes some boundaries and has exhibited some level of questionable behavior in a certain amount of some of his investigations.
In your investigation in the Grosse Pointe News, you said you talked to some people who worked with him, and they described him as like the movie Training Day. And I don't know if people remember Training Day or not, but this was a very popular movie that basically starred Denzel Washington as a cop who made up his own rules as he went along. And as long as he got results, he could do whatever he wanted.
I just want to be clear on that quote, though, to be fair to Tim. The person that gave me that quote, who worked with Tim for a number of years, when he said, "Have you ever seen the movie Training Day?" ? I believe he was referencing the climate within the police department at the time, and I believe he was more talking about the unit in which Tim worked for. Then after that, he said Tim was slick. He was a wheeler dealer type. So it looks, I think, on its face that he's making the correlation between Tim and the Alonzo Harris character, in the movie Training Day, played by Denzel Washington. But if you look a little closer at that quote, to be fair to Tim, he was referring to the police department can sometimes be like the movie Training Day.
Bill Tullock, can you tell us a little bit about how drug units work and how much freedom they have and what their abilities are to kind of work on their own and try and get results?
Well, let me backtrack for just one moment. What did Tim have to gain if he were involved? I'd like to ask that question of Scott.
Well, there are some answers to that question that I don't feel comfortable saying publicly. I know that the facts tell us that there was a phone call. Tim admits to having a phone call with JoAnn. JoAnn's kids were present at said phone call, where Tim allegedly threatened her, told her to stop accusing people or I can make you disappear, quote unquote, according to what JoAnn told her children and what her children heard on the night of that conversation. Tim admits to having the conversation. He puts the timeline a little bit earlier. He says the conversation took place in October of 2009. The kids are putting it more around Christmas or in early December 2009. And Tim says he was merely calling her to confront her about a rumor that was flying around Grosse Pointe, where people were saying that JoAnn was saying that all of JoAnn Matouk, which is another brother, another character in this drama, all of John's problems can be traced back to Tim. And Tim took offense to that.
Now, you also reported that Tim Matouk's ex-wife was either afraid of him or was threatened by him. What was that?
So in the depositions that were tied to the civil litigation, Tim's first wife, I believe his name was Barbara, said that at one point in an argument, Tim had threatened to kill her and that he believed, or she believed, that he could do so. And we know that it wasn't just her family that she was expressing concern to regarding fear for her safety connected to her cousin. She had told something like 11 or 12 people.
Did Tim Matouk take a polygraph test?
Tim Matouk was never taken a polygraph. He's declined to take a polygraph test.
He was asked but declined?
Yes.
All right, Bill, I'll get your response to all of that, but I also want to hear a little bit about how law enforcement works with drug units and how much freedom they have, because that's where Tim Matouk said he was that night. He said he was out with a drug unit, out making runs, although according to Scott here, he reported that they only were in radio contact with him. Nobody had eyes on him.
It really wasn't what I reported. It's what the three other members of the Comet Task Force that were on that surveillance with him said in their deposition testimony, that they were in radio contact with him between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock that night, which was the time frame in which he disappeared, but they were not in visual contact with him.
So, Bill, go ahead and respond to some of that for us.
Sure. I can speak from experience. I worked NET, which was the Oakland County same type unit as Comet was. When we were working a surveillance, we may not have been in visual contact with one another, but we were always in radio communication, and we were relatively close to the target. For someone to go off and about for as much as 3 or 4 hours, I'd be very, very skeptical of that. Most of your narcotics teams are real tight-knit, and they're on top of things. They're not going to be freelancing. They are going to be in radio communication with one another. And as I said, you'll usually have eyes on the target, or you'll be available so that you can put eyes on the target. It's doubtful to me that somebody would be able to go off for 3 or 4 hours on their own.
Scott?
Well, I mean, I'm just reporting what was said in the deposition testimony by the other members of the Comet Task Force that were on that surveillance unit, that they were in radio contact with him for those 4 hours, but they did not see him for those 4 hours. So Tim claims that he has a airtight alibi. I would say he has got about a 90% airtight alibi, and there's 10%, kind of questioning because no one saw him.
Now, what about this witness that supposedly, Paul Hawk, who supposedly saw people in that area and later made a drawing or a sketch, provided information for a sketch artist, and thought it was JoAnn Matouk, but then when the sketch was shown around, they thought it was Tim Matouk.
Well, let me clarify that.
Yeah.
But first, let me backtrack for 1 second and answer Bill's first question about what motive Tim would have. And I don't feel comfortable speaking about everything that I've uncovered, and some of the stuff I've uncovered I haven't been able to report because I don't have enough documentation or not enough evidence, let's say, for me to feel comfortable putting it out to the public. But I will say that I believe, from talking to JoAnn's family and talking to JoAnn's friends, that if you believe them, JoAnn had possibly uncovered some allegations of wrongdoing that her cousin was engaging in, which is why they say that he called her and said, "Stop making accusations, stop asking questions, or I could make you disappear." Now, what that wrongdoing was, allegedly, what that alleged wrongdoing was, I don't know. I think time will tell, and if we can get a little further down the investigation, if we can make that public. But
Bill Tullock, does that just sound like macho talk, or maybe even something that's not necessarily 100% confirmed?
I would say it's macho talk, maybe locker room talk. I said those same words to my first ex-son-in-law that, if this continues the way it is, I could probably make you disappear.
Let's be very clear. It's not confirmed. It's allegations and rumors and innuendo. But I think that we can start from kind of a baseline that she was, according to her family, was in fear for her safety. And that fear stemmed from her uncovering some type of wrongdoing that she personally allegedly tied to her cousin. Now talking about the eyewitness, Paul Hawk, who was kind of a local sports hero in Grosse Pointe in the early 80s. He had a storied football career at Grosse Pointe South. I believe there was some type of vote done in Grosse Pointe in the 1980s to name the #1 player on the football field for that decade between the two high schools. And Paul Hawk was named, Grosse Pointe's Mr. Football for that decade. He was a ferocious fullback, tailback that was kind of known for running through the tackles and running over people. Played at Central Michigan, and then ended up transferring to the University of Michigan, where I believe he was a walk-on for a very short period of time. Now he owns a art gallery with his, I believe, his mom and dad in Grosse Pointe. But he was driving home from the grocery store the night of January 12, 2010, and claims that while he was driving past St. Paul's Church back home, he saw JoAnn's Lexus SUV. He saw what he thought was an unmarked police car, a dark blue or black Crown Victoria, and he saw two men with a person he believed was JoAnn sitting on the brake wall in between Jefferson Avenue or Lakeshore Drive and Lake St. Clair. He
had some interaction with these men, right? They acted like cops.
He stopped his car to see if he could be of assistance and said that the two cops kind of waved him through, told him nothing to see here. And according to Paul, one of them kind of reached into his waistband and kind of made a motion like, "I'm packing, don't worry, move on." So at that point, he didn't think anything of it. At some point in the next week, he's watching television and sees a television report about a woman that went missing from St. Paul's Church that night. And I believe exactly on the 1 week anniversary on January 19th, 2010, Paul went and filed a police report at Grosse Pointe Farms. He claimed that one of the people that he saw resembled JoAnn Matouk, who was JoAnn's baby brother, and someone that she had a very close relationship with, someone that she kind of mothered. And if you follow this case at all or listen to the first episode of this podcast, all of this kind of stems from this giant family feud that erupted between the 5 Matouk siblings over a estate of their parents that was roughly a $20 million estate tied to a wine store and a rare wine trading and selling business, as well as a real estate portfolio. Paul Hawk claimed early on in the first year or two of this investigation that he saw someone that, quote unquote, resembled JoAnn Matouk. Paul had played sports with John. They were the same age. I believe they had played both football and baseball against each other back in the early 80s. I believe they were both class of 84. And John was the starting wide receiver on the Grosse Pointe North football team when Paul was the star running back on the Grosse Pointe South football team. At some point 2 years later, in 2012, Paul Hawk ran into John at Dick O'Dow's in Birmingham and said to himself, "That's not who I saw." At that point, he went to a sketch artist that was paid for by JoAnn's family, and the sketch that he had the sketch artist draw, he then claimed that he saw Tim Matouk.
Now, police also had a problem because he said that it was dusk. He could see as if there was still some daylight, and clearly at 9:30 or
I think it was
7:30. So between 7:30
the sun set on that day at 5:22, and the reason that Grosse Pointe Farms Police, Detective Mike McCarthy and Chief Dan Jensen, who were both in on the interview with Hawk, The reason in their report that they dismissed Hawk's timeline or dismissed Hawk's what he saw was because of the fact that he said it was light outside or it was dusk, when in fact it was 2 hours after the sun had set. So they deemed him not credible and just kind of put his report into the file. And if you talk to the family, the Matouk Romain family, they claim that it was buried, that they didn't know anything about it until they had put a Freedom of Information request in late 2012, or at some point in 2012, came up, got just a sea of documents, and within those documents, they found this eyewitness account that they were never told about.
And Paul Hawk also says that he tried to go to the FBI and the Michigan State Police, and everyone kept telling him to go back, and then eventually they sent him back to the same police department that didn't believe him in the first place.
So he went from Grosse Pointe Farms. When he got no traction there, he went to the state police. The state police told him to go to the FBI. He talked to the FBI. FBI sent him to Grosse Pointe Woods.
Okay, so Bill Tullock, let's bring you in here and give us your take on Paul Hawk and the as a witness.
2 years after the initial observation to now say, this is a sketch of the person I saw 2 years ago under questionable lighting conditions, I'd have to question the credibility. A couple of other points that I'd like to make. I understand in reading some of Scott's article that the night of the incident, Tim would have been driving a van, would not have been driving a Crown Vic. And during my time working in narcotics units, we never drove anything that resembled a patrol car. The other point that I'd like to make is you've got one witness, nobody to corroborate him. The other point I want to make is there's a question in the timeline as to whether or not JoAnn's vehicle was parked at the church at 7:30, or had it been moved at 7:30 and then returned sometime prior to 9:30, or had it been there all along?
So playing on what Bill just said, if you go by the timeline and all the interviews done with the churchgoers by the private investigators and the police, she was seen leaving the church service at 7:20. I believe around 7:21, a witness claims to have heard the car alarm go off. But at 7:35, another witness who says that she had parked her car in the St. Paul's parking lot, got in her car and left the church at 7:35, and claims there was no other cars in the parking lot at 7:35. At some point around 9 o'clock, a Grosse Pointe Farms police officer, Andy Rogers, comes across the car for the first time, runs the plates, decides that he doesn't want to investigate any further and leaves. And then at some point in the next hour, Officer Keith Colombo comes across the car and begins the investigation.
Okay, so let's look at this picture for a second. This is where the car was ultimately found at the end of the night. Supposedly, the family thinks she was parked in a different spot, but near here. Someone would have come out, one of the witnesses would have come out the door of the church there and said they didn't see any cars in front of them, that it was empty.
Right.
So the car was there, then it was empty, then it was here, a couple spots, a little bit different from where it originally was. But we don't know for sure. That's just based on what they put together from the witnesses they talked to.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say, Bill?
The problem I'm having is if I wanted to make this look like a kidnapping, murder, I would have dumped that car somewhere other than at that church. That is still bothering me to this point in time. I never would have returned it to the location from where I took it from. I would have dumped it somewhere in the inner city, and then it would have probably been looked at as an abduction initially, and then the vehicle being dumped. It's hard for me to figure out why somebody would take the car, drive it some distance, dump her body, and then drive it back to that location, with the thought being, what happens if they get stopped by a black and white somewhere in between?
But Bill, part of the deal is that the theory is that they wanted it to look like a suicide. They didn't want it to look like an abduction. She had her car keys in her pocket. The idea was for it to immediately look like she left church, walked across the street, got in that shallow water, and killed
Waded
herself.
out 4 football fields to where the water was over her head.
And then, you have these footprints, snow prints, which certainly don't look like high heel boots that JoAnn was wearing. It looks like, or the theory is anyway, is that somebody wanted it to look like suicide. So they took her, put her in the water elsewhere, and then brought her car back and made these footprints to make it look like she had committed suicide. But these are the boots that she was wearing. Those do not look like the footprints that were found. So as far as if they wanted it to look like a kidnapping and abduction, that would be a different story. But if they did that, Bill, then wouldn't the FBI be immediately jumping in and looking at everybody's phone records and looking at all the family and looking at all the friends? What would have happened if it was a kidnapping and abduction of a woman in Grosse Pointe Farms, Bill?
Well, I think the Michigan State Police would have been immediately involved in it, and the FBI may very well have come into it very soon thereafter. Again, it was a type of caper that might have been too big for the Pointes to handle at the time.
I just want to point out something regarding the police investigation and a comment that was made to one of the private investigators that raised some eyebrows. One of the PIs, who was a retired FBI agent named Bill Randall, who worked organized crime in Detroit for over 30 years and has been retired and working as a PI for the last decade or so. Before that, he works corporate security for Ford. But Bill Randall inquired to Grosse Pointe Farms police about the car and testing the car for DEA and testing the car for DNA and looking at possible fingerprints that had been put on the car. And the response from Grosse Pointe Farms to Bill Randall was, we did a fingerprint analysis, and the only fingerprints that we found were fingerprints of the immediate family. Well, why that raises eyebrows to Bill Randall and other people that have looked at this is that the family claims they were never asked to take fingerprint tests, and that none of them work for a government agency or any other agency that will require fingerprints on file. So whose fingerprints are Grosse Pointe Farms claiming that the family members' fingerprints were in the car when they say that to Bill Randall, when none of the family was fingerprinted?
And having experts come and said this isn't how you'd actually find fingerprints on these kinds of surfaces, and it's actually wrong.
And they also said that they declined to do any DNA analysis of both the car as well as a scarf that was found in the median in between St. Paul's and the break wall. A witness had seen someone that she described as a man down by the lake with a dark scarf on. I believe Andy Rogers, who was the first Grosse Pointe Farms police officer to come across the car at 9 o'clock, he came back to the scene when Officer Colombo started investigating around 10-ish, according to their own timeline, the Grosse Pointe Farms timeline, based on timestamps, and found a scarf and kept the scarf in the evidence locker for 5 years, never dusting it for prints, never doing a DNA analysis, and then admittedly gave the scarf to charity, gave it to Goodwill, which seems a little, it's puzzling.
Bill, sometimes small towns don't get many murders, and I don't imagine Grosse Pointe Farms has had more than a couple in the past decade. But tell me a little bit about what you see. You watched the Unsolved Mystery show. You've watched the Channel 4 reports. You've been reading Scott's reports in the Grosse Pointe News. What is your take on the investigation as far as the car, the fingerprints, the scarf, these items?
Not very thorough. You're absolutely right. The exterior of the vehicle, you may very well have been able to capture prints by dusting, but the interior should have been fumed with the glue process. If somebody had been in that car and drove it to another location, there may have been fingerprints down where they had to adjust the seat or the steering wheel. I would have wanted to take a look at that area. Same thing with the scarf. If there was any question whatsoever that, it may have been wrapped around somebody's face, it should have been a piece of evidence and should have been processed for, DNA or whatever. It was a very, very questionable investigation.
Let me say this. I'm not going to publicly go on record and say that I believe that there was a police cover-up or a giant conspiracy. That's, I think, for later down the line, the more evidence that we find. What I will say, and I've said this to Kevin on this podcast, I believe I said it to Kevin when I interviewed on WJR, I think at the very least, and what I would consider best case scenario for Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods police, this was lazy, shoddy police work. At the very least.
So, and that's one of the reasons why it would be nice if the FBI came in and took a look, or if the U.S. attorney took a look. Or
it'd be nice if Grosse
Michigan
Pointe
State
police would talk. It'd be nice if they would talk to me. Nobody at either one of those police departments will say a word. I'll give Andy Petrowski credit. He at least got on the phone with me. He wouldn't go on the record, but he's the only police officer that I reached out to that would even call me back. He's the chief of Huntington Woods now.
Bill Tullock, retired police officer. If your investigation said it was a suicide, and 10 years later, Unsolved Mystery was doing a report, a local TV station was doing an investigation, the newspaper was doing an investigation, would you just have no comment, or would you come out and talk about this?
I'd come out and talk about it. Be as open as you can. Family has some questions. Cops deal in facts, not innuendos. But if some of those things can be substantiated, absolutely take a look at them. Give some closure to the family.
So I wanted to ask you, Scott, before we move on, and it's not like Tim Matouk is the suspect. It's just one possible suspect that mentioned, because JoAnn had said if something happens to me, look to him. But there's other people.
He probably would be considered the quote unquote top suspect or the person of most interest. But there were other people that you would consider characters in this drama that maybe had some questions to answer.
Before we move on to them, just tell me a little bit about Tim Matouk and his deposition. Did we learn anything from his hours of depositions that he's given under oath?
Just a lot of denials, and that was really the only thing I was able to go on for my story.
Did he talk about a phone call with JoAnn?
He admits to having a phone call with JoAnn. He places the timeline of that phone call in October. JoAnn's family places it in December. He says that JoAnn hung up on him and that he merely called to confront her about rumors that he believed that she was spreading around Grosse Pointe, that quote unquote all of JoAnn Matouk's problems were because of Tim.
Yeah, but didn't you say that the family members had said JoAnn said that Tim Matouk said I could make you disappear or something like that?
Yes, I thought I said that earlier today.
Yeah, no, but he denied that.
He denied, right. He claims that the purpose of the phone call was to confront JoAnn about those rumors that he believed that she was spreading, and that he never said anything about making her disappear or stop asking questions or stop making accusations, that it was simply a phone call to confront her about those rumors.
And what about the ex-wife?
I'm not certain if he was asked about the ex-wife. I have to go through the deposition testimony.
What about the alibi?
Alibi, he claims that his alibi is airtight because he was logged in as a member of the Comet Squad on that surveillance target in Warren. And it was a quote unquote rolling surveillance. For the people that don't know police lingo, it means that you have a target and you're surveilling that target over a lengthy period of time, and that one member of the task force has the surveillance duty, let's say from 12 o'clock in the afternoon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they're replaced by another member of the surveillance unit that has it from 3 to 6. So you don't have all the members of the Comet Task Force all looking or observing this one target. You're rolling them. It's excessive.
All right, let's talk about another brother, Bill Matouk. Why if at all?
I don't think
might
Bill.
he be-
I just want to be clear. I don't think Bill Matouk has ever been considered a quote unquote suspect.
No, as a character. You mentioned there's other characters in this story. Well,
I just want to be clear.
All right, tell us about Bill Matouk and what you've been able to find out as it relates to this case.
Bill Matouk is JoAnn's brother, also a younger brother. Him and John have kind of been at the center of this family squabble, and a lot of that acrimony and tension dates back to when they were little kids. From talking to people that are familiar with the family dynamic, they've never gotten along. And when the estate dispute erupted into this kind of full-fledged Hatfield and McCoy's type war, they were on opposite sides. JoAnn sided with John. Bill's the oldest sibling, Rosemary, sided with Bill. Rosemary and Bill were the people that inherited the wine store, Woods Wine and Spirits on Mack Avenue, from their mom and dad, and they've run the wine store, I believe, since the 1990s.
Wasn't there a meeting there where JoAnn went to this place and came out white as a ghost, scared to death? What happened?
Yeah, what do we know?
Okay,
so about to get to that. So first, Bill and Rosemary, or Bill was removed as executor of the estate when there was a civil suit alleging wrongful allocation of the funds that the family left for the siblings to disperse. And then there was a break in communications. The two sides of this family feud stopped talking for about 2 or 3 years. They had some interactions on a trip to Florida back in 2006, which was about 5 or 6 years after the estate had been settled. And I think there was some level of cordial relations. And they had a couple dinners together. And then after that trip in 2006, communication ceased. Nobody spoke to each other for over 2 years, almost 3 years.
And this was about kind of the estate money.
All over the estate.
$20 million.
Yeah. At some point in late 2009, around New Year's, JoAnn decided that she wanted to either bury the hatchet or reach out to Bill for a meeting or a discussion. And she called Bill on the phone, first time in 3 years. They spoke. They decided to have a face-to-face. I believe that took place on December 30th, the day before New Year's 2009. According to Bill, the conversation was about Tim and JoAnn expressing her concerns over their cousin Tim Matouk, who Bill is very close with. They're very close friends, first cousins and very close friends. At some point after New Year's, let's say January 2nd or 3rd, there was another meeting, but this one was impromptu. She didn't call and tell Bill that she was on her way to see him. She just popped in to the liquor store, driven by her daughter, Michelle. The meeting lasted, 20 minutes or so. And according to Michelle, JoAnn's daughter, who was driving the car, JoAnn came out very disturbed and white as a ghost and very fidgety and worried and anxious, and said, you need to take me to church. I need to pray. And according to Michelle, she wanted to quote unquote pray it away, whatever she saw. And she wouldn't tell Michelle or her other children or her brother John what exactly took place at that liquor store, only that she had uncovered something that worried her, and that if she told her family, they would be putting them in jeopardy. Bill claims that, yes, there was a second meeting, an impromptu meeting, when she popped into the liquor store in the days after New Year's, but says that the meeting really wasn't eventful and simply was a rehashing of the meeting 3 or 4 days ago, where JoAnn was expressing concern about Tim.
Was she scared enough to go to the police, or do you know if she ever?
My reporting tells me, or I reported in my second installment of the story, that she went to went to quote unquote federal authorities. And I have a source in the McNamara building, where all the federal agencies are stationed downtown Detroit, off Michigan Avenue. And I was told that there was a meeting on January 7th at a local restaurant between JoAnn and quote unquote federal authorities. Could be the FBI, could be the U.S. Attorney's Office, could be DEA. We're not sure. But we know that 5 days after that meeting, she disappeared. And my source in the McNamara building told me that the scuttlebutt around the McNamara at that time was that there was a fear that that meeting had leaked.
Bill Tullock, give us your take on Bill Matouk as a character in this story.
Well, I understand he was one of the siblings who received a large percentage of that $20 million. I'd like to know, how heavily invested he was in the wine store, perhaps real estate. I also heard it either from you or from Scott that was there some type of a sports book or whatever that was being operated out of that wine store, and he may have been responsible for that. Are there any underworld ties involved? Did he owe anybody any money? Did anybody have a vendetta against him? And perhaps, showed they were serious by, going after JoAnn.
I just want to be very clear that I have not, that is merely speculation and innuendo, that it's never been reported. I'm not saying that there was a sports book being run out of that liquor store. I want to be very clear about that. There is a character in this saga that is a bookmaker that is friends with both Bill and was friends with John, where there was a gambling debt accrued. That plays a role possibly in this narrative.
Not connected to the wine store.
But I'm not reporting. I will repeat again. I am not reporting that that liquor store was being used as a way for bookmaking to be.
And to be clear, Michelle Romain, who drove JoAnn to the wine shop that night, says that she has no idea what scared her mom so bad. Her mom never told her what she saw that scared her so bad, just that she wanted to immediately go to church and pray it away. And then you have learned that at some point she met with federal law authorities,
federal law enforcement,
for some reason, and maybe related to that or maybe not related to that.
And well, she was telling her family, her daughters, her son, her brother John, that she needed to go to law enforcement to tell them what she had found out, but she didn't feel comfortable going to local law enforcement, that she had to go to federal law enforcement. Now, they did not know about this meeting that I uncovered. And I also want to state for the record that Bill claims that the estimation of the estate being $20 million is incorrect. He says that it wasn't that much money.
Okay. Bill, your take on, people being afraid to go to local law enforcement, and just any other comments on what Scott has been reporting?
It's a real fear that we see all of the time. Maybe the feds weren't the right agency to go to, but the Michigan State Police, we all have friends in law enforcement. Obviously, they weren't going to go to Tim because of the rivalry that existed there. But, it doesn't do a lot of good to chat amongst yourselves and, make innuendos. You need, if you're the victim of a crime, you see something that is suspicious, out of the ordinary, it needs to be reported. Go to the Detroit Police Department, go to the Michigan State Police, go to the Attorney General. If all else fails, go to the FBI. But should have taken what information they had. If they thought it was a crime or harm was going to come to somebody, it should have been reported immediately to law enforcement. And like I always said, if you go to the patrol officer and he kind of blows you off, he works for a sergeant, you go to the sergeant. Sergeant blows you off, you go to the lieutenant. Lieutenant blows you off, you go to the captain. Captain blows you off, you go to the chief. If the locals don't want to deal with it, you take it higher, higher, higher.
Bill, so one of the problems there is that the family did take all their information to the local police, and the local police said it's a suicide. We're done with it. We've determined in 5 minutes that this is a suicide, so we don't need any more information. We've already solved this case. It's a suicide. So when the police tell you, sorry, it's a suicide, we're not investigating any further, what is the family supposed to do then? And what is your take on Scott's source that that she did talk to someone either in the FBI or some federal law enforcement official. What should have happened from that meeting? Should there have been something official that took place from there?
Well, the questions of the family should have been answered, obviously. I have seen suicides that I'll swear I thought they were homicides. And through good, thorough investigation, we were able to come up with enough information to, say beyond any reasonable doubt that no, this was not a homicide, it was a suicide. In this particular case, I don't think they have the information or the evidence to sustain that this was a suicide. Every bit and piece of information should have been investigated. The pieces should have been put together, and there should have been a much more thorough investigation.
Okay.
And if there was a meeting with the FBI or DEA or U.S. Attorney's Office, and she disappeared or ended up being killed because of that meeting, then all of a sudden it becomes a federal case with the murder of a witness. Because from my research and reporting over the years about organized crime, you don't actually have to have made a deal or cut a deal on paper with the government in order for someone to be charged with murdering a government witness. As long as a meeting occurred, that's enough.
But that doesn't appear to have been pursued.
Right. And the FBI officially commented to both Channel 4 and myself that they will neither confirm or deny that a meeting took place.
What does that tell you, Bill?
Well, typical FBI talk. They're pretty good at saying we don't want to go down that road yet. Well, I think they need to go down that road in this particular case. If family members came and gave them information, it would behoove them to say, yes, we looked into the matter. There was nothing to substantiate or sustain the information. And as far as we're concerned, it's a closed case. But to leave it hanging the way they did, nah, that's not the right way to do it.
And finally, Bill's never been named as a suspect. He's just a character.
There's no criminal investigation for anyone really
for
to be
anybody,
named as a suspect.
Yeah, because nobody's investigating on the record. But do you know if Bill Matouk ever took a polygraph test or was asked to?
Bill was never asked by law enforcement to take a polygraph. He's been asked by his brother John to take a polygraph and has refused. Tim refused to take a polygraph. John took a polygraph and passed.
All right, let's talk about John Matouk.
So John is the baby brother of JoAnn. They had a very close relationship. John was someone that went off on his own in the 1990s, didn't go into the family business, and became an incredibly successful young entrepreneur and became a millionaire in his 20s. In 1995, Crane's Business, Detroit, named him one of the into the prestigious 40 Under 40 club. At some point in the 2000s, a lot of his business dealings kind of fell apart. There was some burned bridges. There was some lost money. There were some rumors of gambling debt. And he was, kind of not in a great financial place at the time of his sister's disappearance. And there became some questions about a gambling debt that was owed to a person by the name of Anthony Pipia, who I want to state for the record has never been arrested, has never been convicted or accused in a court of law of being a bookmaker. But I have a number of sources, multiple sources, claiming that back in 2010, Anthony Pipia was a bookmaker and that his bookmaking operation was a offshoot of the Allen Hilf gambling empire. Allen Hilf was a very high-ranking Jewish member of organized crime, ran the biggest sports book business in Michigan and one of the biggest in the United States. He passed away in 2014. So there's some discrepancies in how much was owed, but it was at the very least tens of thousands of dollars. Some people claim it reached into the six-figure range. And when JoAnn first disappeared, the knee-jerk reaction or the immediate instinct of the family was actually not to point the finger at Tim right away, or let's say in addition to pointing the finger at Tim right away, they looked to John and believing that maybe someone that was upset with John might have hurt JoAnn because John was so close to JoAnn and wanting to do him harm by harming someone that was so dear to his heart. John immediately agreed to take a polygraph and passed. So he was pretty quickly eliminated by the limited investigation that was done as a suspect. But both Bill and Tim Matouk, when they were interviewed by members of law enforcement as well as private investigators, say if there was any foul play related to JoAnn's disappearance and death, that it came from John or someone that was trying to do harm to John.
So just common sense, though, wise, when I think of this story, in Unsolved Mysteries kind of made it look like that might have been what happened. Maybe somebody who owed John money was responsible.
But John owed money.
John owed money. And if John owed money to someone and someone came and killed your sister, wouldn't they come and say, I killed your sister and I'll pay up? And wouldn't that be...
No, I don't even look at it that way. They would come and kill John.
Right. Why bother killing the sister?
John would be the one that they would do harm to.
But even if they killed the sister, wouldn't they then come and say, I'm going to kill someone else you love next if you don't pay up?
And let me also be clear. Anthony Pipia, not only has he never been accused or charged of any bookmaking activities, he is not someone that is viewed as a violent person. He's never been accused of any violence. Everyone that I've spoken to that knows him and that has told me that he's a bookmaker have been clear when I've asked them, do you think he could be involved in any criminal violence? They all say he's not a violent person. That's not, he's not known as a knuckle dragger or a thug, more of a kind of a gentleman bookmaker. So, I mean, who knows? I know that
the other thing that's interesting is John has really been pursuing this, that it's a cover-up. He's gone on Unsolved Mysteries. He's gone on the local news.
For the last 7 years, he's been flying planes during the summer, making accusations against his brother and his cousin.
He's pushing as hard as anybody for police to investigate.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do that if you were a part of it, for sure. And you probably wouldn't do that if you felt you were responsible for it, unless you felt you were responsible and really wanted to find that person.
Yeah.
But that's not what he thinks. He thinks it's somewhere else. And he's pursued that heavily.
I just have a hard time. I mean, I'm going to report, and I have reported about the gambling debt and about Mr. Pippi and whatnot. But, for someone that studies organized crime for a living and has made my name and my brand off of being, a mob researcher and studying these guys and studying their behavior, I have a hard time believing that this came from mob figures trying to get retribution on John by hurting JoAnn. That's just not how these guys operate.
Bill Tullock, retired law enforcement. Tell us your take on this whole theory on John Matouk, the polygraph, and this whole idea that he owed money to someone and therefore they killed his sister JoAnn.
It's a possibility. Having been involved in law enforcement for 37 years and having spent the last 25 years in Las Vegas, there's no such thing as a gentleman bookmaker. Anyone who's owed money, will take it very, very serious, and who knows how far they would go. I'd like to know how much of a gambling debt John had. I'd like to know how many toes he may have stepped on back during his real estate speculation days. Last week, we talked a little bit about the fact that, I believe it was a fact, that JoAnn had bailed John out on a couple of occasions. There's always the possibility that she says, hey, that bank is dried up. And this may have been a way by which John was pressured to pay up if he did have a debt that was tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Who knows? It's a lead that would be worthy of being investigated. And again, as we talked last week, this is something that law enforcement should take a look at.
Well, I think it was investigated in the sense of like as I said, the very limited investigation that took place. He was asked by law enforcement to take a polygraph, and he took a polygraph and he passed it. So, I mean, it has been investigated to some extent. In terms of the numbers, it depends on who you talk to. John says it was a $90,000 debt. Other people I've talked to claimed it was upwards of $200,000 or more.
All right, let's talk about David Romain now. David Romain is the ex-husband of JoAnn. Tell us what you've been able to find out about him, and what is this character's role in this story.
So Dave Romain was JoAnn's estranged husband at the time, but they were on speaking terms. He raised some eyebrows by marrying her best friend, Sandy. So right now he's married to Sandy Bone, who was JoAnn's closest confidant. It gives it a little bit of more of a kind of a soap opera-y element to his role in all of this. He's a owner of a food distribution company. He's always denied any role in this. He took a polygraph that was inconclusive, but the polygraph operator that did the report on his inconclusive test said that they believed that the inconclusive nature of the test was more related to, or was related to, his embarrassment or his denial of extramarital affairs, or being unfaithful, infidelity, that it didn't have anything to do with him knowing or being a part of her disappearance. In terms of an alibi, we know that he was with JoAnn's children at the time that JoAnn disappeared, having dinner at Andiamo Trattoria on Mac. And Dave was someone that was, like I said, wasn't estranged from JoAnn in the sense that they had some type of bitter falling out where they weren't speaking to each other. They were actually co-defendants in a civil lawsuit against a builder for a black mold case in the house that they had lived in and shared together. And they were at court together all day on January 10th, 2012. And there was really no reports of them fighting or of them, there being tension between them. Only the fact that at that point they were separated, not officially divorced, and eventually it came out that he married her close friend.
And just for the record, that black mold case, JoAnn Matouk was possibly going to get a very large reward. Yeah. That's not the kind of thing where you go have someone killed because they're going to get a large reward. The builder, right?
Right.
So that's not even a possibility.
And just the notion that the police have put forward that she had mental health problems, or that she was depressed, or she was despondent, doesn't jibe with interviews of the people that were around her in the days leading up to her disappearance. They interviewed all the people at the law firm, Blake Kirshner, who was handling that civil case. All of the attorneys and paralegals and secretaries say that she was in a very spirited mood, a very happy and confident mood, because they believed they were about to get a $1 million settlement. And they had finally got in front of a jury after like a 7-year process of briefs being filed back and forth. She was on the verge of testifying, which she was very eager to do. In fact, she was supposed to testify on January 13th.
Bill Tullock, your take on David Romain as a character?
I would not consider him a suspect, but at this point in time, everyone's a suspect. If they had a halfway decent relationship, there was back and forth between him and the kids. There was not the Hatfield McCoy between him and her that there was with her family members. And what did he have to gain by her death? I would put him in the background, but again, everyone's a suspect.
One thing to add, according to John, he drove by the liquor store at some point in the hours or days after JoAnn disappeared. And he claims that he saw Dave Romain, Bill Matouk, Tim Matouk, and Tony Pipia, all, their cars all in the parking lot, and the light on in the second floor of the liquor store. He put the two and two together in his mind from that situation and believes that there was some type of meeting taking place.
And we're going to get into that next week in detail, but I want to leave you guys with one last little tidbit to the mystery that you reported, and that is that it's not often that you get a report to the police or the Coast Guard that somebody is committing suicide in January across the street from the church. But JoAnn wasn't the only report that came in that day. Tell us about a report that came in about an hour and a half earlier.
So there were 2 phone calls logged by the Coast Guard. The one that sent all of the, sent the cavalry, if you will, with the boats and the planes and the helicopters and the divers and the dogs. Again, that's another disputed timeline. According to the timestamp by the Coast Guard, that call was made at 9:30. The cavalry, quote unquote, was dispatched at 9:38, and they were on the scene by 9:51. The Grosse Pointe Farms police disputes that and says the call was made at 10:30, and they actually have a couple people within the Coast Guard that back that timeline up. But there was a whole other phone call that was logged at 6 o'clock, which was at a time when JoAnn was at her lawyer's office meeting at Blake Kirshner discussing strategy for the civil lawsuit, and was a good 80 minutes away from when she was last seen. And this call came in and was almost identical to the call that either came in at 9:30 or 10:30, depending on whose timeline you refer to for the latter call. But there was a call that came into the Coast Guard at 6 o'clock claiming that a woman had gone into the water by St. Paul's at 5 o'clock an hour earlier, and that her family was frantic looking for her, and that there needed to be some type of search launched. There was no search launched, but it was logged, timestamp that call came in at 6 o'clock. The second call is what elicited the search.
And what does the family think that first call was?
The family thinks it was a misstep in the conspiracy, and that they, quote unquote, jumped the gun. And according to Michelle, timestamps don't lie. That's what she said. Bill
Tullock, what do you make of that?
Geez, I wonder if there was a full moon that night. I don't put a lot of faith in timestamps. I put a lot of faith in eyewitnesses and corroboration. And unfortunately, in this case, we don't have a lot of either.
All right, Bill Tullock, we're out of time. We'll pick it up there next week, MatoukMystery.com. Thank you very much for joining us and all of your insight. Scott, fascinating. When does your next report come out? And give us a little teaser.
Comes out on Thursday. It's the last part of my investigation. It gets into the discovery of the body, the autopsies. There's a whole situation with her keys, and there were 2 sets of keys, one set of keys that she had on her, another set of keys that had been stolen from the family house a couple months before she disappeared. And the Grosse Pointe Farms police returned the set of keys that had been stolen to her family in the weeks after she disappeared, which weren't the set of keys that she had on her. They found a whole other set of keys on her when they found her body, which is suspicious. And then I get into the civil lawsuit. And then at the very end, and we can talk about this next week, I tie allegations or questions about whether or not this JoAnn Romain Matouk case is tied to another unsolved mystery that took place of another Grosse Pointer who disappeared into the water, was initially deemed a suicide. It was then, after that, was discovered to be a murder. A banker by the name of David Widlack, whose bank was kind of kitty corner to the liquor store, who disappeared in September of 2010 on his way to a meeting, and then was found in Lake St. Clair in October of 2010. The initial autopsy showed that it was a suicide. A second autopsy found a bullet in the back of his head.
The mystery gets murkier. You can follow all of this at MatoukMystery.com. You can find links to Scott's reporting, to the Unsolved Mystery case, to the Channel 4 reporting, and any updates that come, we will bring it to you right there. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.